are competing in, we are repeating in, we are believing in. It's time for us to shift our mind from best in the world to best for the world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift, intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.
Welcome to episode 4 of FiDE. And in this program, we're actually exploring life in itself and the fundamental assumptions that we hold about life. And how suitable that today's topic is fundamental assumptions. My name is Jens Rennelt, and with me in the studio, Stellan Nordal. Welcome, Stellan.
Thank you very much, and it's good to actually we come to this far in this program. And fundamental assumptions is something that I'm quite eager to explore because I guess that it's first when you realize that you make assumptions about the world that you can actually change them. So for me, this is a very interesting topic. And I would say, hopefully we will touch upon a lot of things that are very close to what we call ourselves, what we call our organizations, what we call our society, and what we call our world. So the fundamental assumptions, as I see it, the sum of them is the worldview we have. So that's how I'm thinking of it, at least. And it will be... I'm looking forward to look into this topic.
Yeah, and if you have listened to the previous episodes where we talked about the tree metaphor and the ID model, the intentional decisions model in itself, we also have seen that one of the fundamental assumptions there already is choice. So that's the fundamental assumption that this whole model is actually building upon, is that we always have a choice. So we can say that this is at least one of the assumptions that we see. And I think you already dived straight into the topic. How we create our worldview is by the collective assumptions that we hold. And I think you also touch upon an aspect that you need to have a certain awareness level. There's certain, because you said when you realize that you make assumptions, you also realize that you can choose them. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, definitely. And you can always think of, do I choose? At some level there is a choice, but I don't think that most people see it that way. And I believe there is a very interesting word or concept here, which I would like to introduce, and that is something called the continuum concept. The continuum concept was coined by a woman called, a researcher called Lidloff now it's like I think it was already in the 80s. She studied indigenous people, and she came up with this idea or concept, or whatever we call it, the continuum concept, as a way of describing worldview or values or whatever we can call it. So what you found out was that in the first part of life, we more or less got it by the breast milk. And then in the second part of life, we more or less attracted those events and experiences that show that this was true for us. And in the third part of life, we do everything to how can I say, defend that worldview. That is what you call the continuum concept, which for an indigenous people was maybe what actually kept the whole world going, as the elderly was seen as the wise, and very often the leader of the tribe or was maybe someone who was in their maybe productive age, but the wisdom was in the elderly. So even if the operational things that were done were made by younger people, the strategic decisions or those affecting the long-term perspective were done by the elderly. So I would say the continuum concept is something that is quite interesting to think of when we talk about having a choice of or choosing a new assumption.
What's the stage in where you explore new worldviews?
Yeah.
Is there something said in this research as well? Because it seems like whatever worldview you're brought up with, whatever worldview you are accustomed to, it is more like that you're, as you explicitly said it, you reinforce the experiences and you reinforce the beliefs that in the end basically defend your own worldview. So what I'm thinking of is like, when is there a way of stepping behind our worldview, or trying to find a way of challenging our assumptions, or trying to explore, like, is this really true?
I would say one thing is when there is some kind of a big event in someone's life, a trauma more or less, then you maybe question your life or your lifestyle or your choices you have made, the situation that you're in, the circumstances that have been part of your life for a long time and so on. So when I meet people, very often this is what have triggered the idea of choosing a new assumption. Maybe if it's not put in that words, but maybe that is actually what is happening. Let's say that you all of a sudden became a parent, maybe in a situation where you didn't believe that was the way forward. I wouldn't say being a parent is a trauma, but it's a huge event. Another one could be that you have been in a working situation for many years and you found yourself more or less exhausted by the whole thing, and you came to a point where you have to do something very different and dramatically different to what have been before. Maybe when you're in a divorce, maybe when you are facing close death in close to yourself in the family or in with very good friends and so on. That is often when people, I wouldn't say reflect, because that's not the first thing that happens. It's more like you can call it almost a trauma, even if, again, not being a parent is a trauma. In most cases it was, but again, a big event causing I wouldn't say situation, but almost a situation where you question yourself.
Yeah, a very strong emotional response, I would say. And you're absolutely right. Normally we assume this is a trauma, but I think I would like to point out that you can also have a very joyful experience, a very blissful state, and a very happy, strong emotional experience. I think in that way you could also reflect on if some of the assumptions that you hold are true. I'm thinking of an example here of my own, and I think it points to something else that it's for us, at least for me, it is sometimes challenging to focus on the on the good things that are happening in life. Maybe this is also an assumption that I and other people can challenge, or is it, what am I looking for when, if we look at the situation, am I looking at what is working and can I amplify this, or can I look at something and see what is not working and basically point out, well, this is not working, and what do I do, or what do I bring again to this situation with
Yeah,
this perspective.
what you're talking about here is actually the continuum concept in a very short time period. So you get some kind of an amplification of whatever choice you do. Very often I talk about where you steer your focus. So what you focus on will grow, and you're actually nourishing it. So by putting a focus on it. So of course this is of very large interest here. Where do we choose to put our focus on? And but I also believe that a lot of those, you and I, we call them fundamental assumptions. We can call it truths or whatever we put into it, beliefs. At some level, all of those beliefs are false beliefs, which is very interesting in itself, I would say, because they are both enabling us to do stuff or think of things or see stuff, but they're also limiting us. And for instance, in the Western world, we have been told, at least I was in school, that I have to see it to believe it. But what happens is that it's maybe the other way around. I have to believe it to be able to see it. And this is when you realize that my belief system is what is actually creating the world. No more, no less.
And I think that's also what I heard from your first sentence, is that we make experiences that reinforce our belief system. But it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The belief systems that I have, or the assumptions that I have, this is what is mirrored back to me when I engage with the world, when I meet other people. And in that way, I could be believing that this is the experiences that I make. But if I then step back and look at it from a different perspective, then I can realize maybe a different interpretation of the situation was possible. And I have actually found a very nice description from a guy called Robert Keegan. He's, I think, Harvard professor, developmental constructivist, and he's basically writing about the evolving self, evolving consciousness. And the description I like from him is when he says we evolve when we understand something, or when this particular thing, let's call it from belief system or belief for a moment, is no longer holding us, but we hold it. So we can actually step behind it, look at it, and see what it does to us. And then it is not having the grip on us anymore, and we are, I guess, unconsciously driven by it. But we can then step behind it and choose, how would like to deal with this? And I find this a very helpful visualization.
Yeah, it is. And that goes actually back then to the one of the really fundamental assumptions, and that is life happening to us, or are we creating it? And I mean, the story right now for the listeners on SoundCloud or on the podcast, right, or wherever they are on podcast, or they can't see right now where you're sitting, but you're sitting in my library. And for those who are following us on YouTube, you have probably seen that behind you, Jens, is a book called The Genes. And that is interesting, because we more or less have been told that the genes control our life. It's the selfish gene, which is actually reproducing itself, and its main purpose in life is to reinforce itself.
So don't tell me that if the genes are changeable, then nothing is static anymore. The last thing I was hoping for is the biological evolution.
The biological evolution. Yeah, but you can still have the biological evolution, but maybe you have to add something on it. And that was a topic that was added, I don't know how many years now, but at least 10, 15 years ago, with epigenetics, the area of above genes. Epi means above, so epigenetics means above genes. And the reason behind this coming up as a research area or research interest was that when we made this big Hugo project in the world, the Human Genome Project, where you categorized all the genome. We believe that this will be the answer to everything in our lives. The thing was that there were three times more expressions of genes than there were genes. So it needed something else also. So the genes were not the only description. That was realized back then. And epigenetics is actually connecting the genes to our, we can call it inner environment, if that's the, I don't know if that's a good expression, but our belief system, more or less. So back then this was very odd. Today I would say this is almost mainstream research. Not really, but almost. And one of those pioneers was a guy called Dr. Bruce Lipton, who made a lot of contribution in this research area the first couple of years. Today it's a big topic.
So what it actually means is that you can change your genes, right, with your belief system by choosing what kind of, first of all, beliefs I hold, but also what kind of behavior do I choose daily, and thereby steering evolution. I mean,
it's actually down to thoughts. So it's as basic as thoughts, actually. So behavior, I guess we have known for a long time now, maybe 25, 30 years, I don't know how long. But this research topic, epigenetics, also not only suggests but also proves that our belief system in terms of thoughts and feelings changed the genes.
Yeah, and I would like to, because what comes to my mind is, I have unfortunately forgotten the name, but if you, there's an experiment, or I think it's also an art collection, I think from a Japanese man, who visualized what happens if you say nice words to water, for example, or if you say swear words to water. And what he shows in microscopic visualizations of the water cell structure is that whenever you choose to say a nice word, it forms really nice looking crystals. And if you swear to the water, the cell structure changes over time to I guess not so nice looking structure. And I think here I bring this up in order to make us aware of, like, the choices that we make, they really have an effect, not only on how I relate to myself, how I relate to my people around me, even to my own biological evolution. And that is something which is really interesting, and well, it brought me to the point where I'm trying to be much more aware of what I'm thinking, what I'm saying, how I'm interacting with people.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that the one person that they're having the most conversations with is themselves, and that is also, of course, interesting when you realize this, because then you can choose. On the other side of that coin is, if I then choose something that is not good for me, then I'm the one to blame. And this is the opposite to what we've been told, because we were told that everything happened to us, and I'm not to blame for my childhood, or for my marriage, or for my work situation, or anything like that. But on the other hand, that story also disables us from actually making a choice, and this story now then enables us to do it. And if you then have the core belief, or whatever we call it again, fundamental assumption, that choice is connected to guilt, then you have a big problem there. And this is one of the fundamental assumptions, I would say, which is very, very strong in many societies today, many families, and that is that not only you get the big what I call it, ability to change something when you're responsible. You also get the blame for it when it's not working or it didn't take you where you wanted, and that's a big problem with adding the possibility of choice.
I mean, how can I say it with as much empathy as I can, is it's not surprising if you have this outside-in perspective of I'm a victim of my circumstances, then I need to basically blame everybody else around me or the situation or whatever. But at the same time, if you point, a finger to somebody else, 3 fingers point back to you. And we talked in the last program about the intentional decision model, actually about that in order to make a choice, we also need to have resources to make good choices, or to make a choice actually in order to be able to choose. And what I'm trying to get at is that, we need, in a way, an ethical framework in order to understand which directions we are choosing.
Yes. And I would also like to add something else when we talk about this, because it's not only an ethical framework, it's also about, even if there is a choice, you don't always have the resources to use that choice, or even the ability at all. For instance, again, when you were a child and something happened in your situation, you were not maybe even entitled into that context to even make another choice, because of your parents were the one that were supposed to take those choices for you. And if you were in a dysfunctional family, you couldn't do it. So we also have to have some kind of we can call it empathy, but that has to be a part of that ethical framework, that at that point I didn't have the ability, for instance, as a child to make any other choices. First of all, I maybe didn't realize that they were wrong. The situation maybe was the only one presented, and how can then that be wrong? And in the next step, when I realized, okay, this is wrong, even if I'm the kid and the parents should know better, I realized that I can't change it because my parents are the one dictating my world, or whatever it is. But then we move into an adult age, and then there is actually the possibility to make another choice on how we describe ourselves and the belief system we choose from that point and forward. So at some level, you're always the sum of your choices, but never more than a new choice away from another life, which is also interesting in itself. And again, if you add guilt to it, then you are stuck.
Yeah, and especially coming back to what you said before, it's like how many talks do we have with ourselves? How do we relate to ourselves? And do we also have guilt towards ourselves for not making decisions in the past that we now understand are more appropriate? And I think it's an unfair comparison, actually, because you're trying to compare something that you know now better with a older version of yourself that didn't have this understanding. So also have some empathy, towards yourself in that regard.
In your previous version of yourself, yeah. I believe that is interesting. It's actually something I was thinking of this week, because we have been talking about empathy as a possibility of putting yourselves into someone else's shoes, and that someone else could be a future version of yourself. But it could also be a previous version of yourself, which is, I believe, something that not many people do. Feeling grateful for me in a previous version, being grateful for having experiences, even if they're hard, and embracing them. And that is also interesting. And again, this is connected to those fundamental assumptions, because again, if we are more or less victims of the genes, or victims of the circumstances, things are happening to us, then there is nothing good we can make out of it. But if we realize that my choices not only define me, but they also define me forward, that makes me able to make a new choice and choose another fundamental assumption. We can have some examples of assumptions that we maybe not are aware of, and one that is close to the genes, and the selfish gene is that also leads to the fundamental assumption of competition. And we brought up with competition as something that is good and developing, I guess.
So what you're saying is that there's a gene for it, or
no? But the selfish genes, the selfish gene is the competitive gene. It's supposed to reproduce on behalf of all the others. That is competition. So if you have that worldview about competition, then the selfish gene amplifies it. But again, it's just a fundamental assumption. So if we look at the nature, for instance, with the understanding of epigenetics, or even if we have an understanding of something deeper behind, we can't see it, we can call it the soul or whatever, something we can't see. If there is something deeper on it, then we realize that when we look at nature, competition is not the answer any longer. Together will then be the answer. And competition, which was previously known as the dominant behavior, is something that it still exists, but it's not dominant any longer. It's almost something extraordinary.
And I think it's so interesting because you can see everything in nature happening, and if you can of course argue that certain species compete for the same resources, for the same food, but then you also realize that they are all part of a bigger eternal life cycle. That maybe the dying, that the how can I say, the lion that eats a gazelle, that is part of the life,
Yeah, but it's not only that the lion eats the gazelle, because it also does other things. It's not the only thing the lion does. The lion also sleeps tonight and so on. So I guess that it's the story behind it is limiting, and it's also limiting ourselves in terms of if we go for the genome is the answer, then we are stuck in history also. It's more or less that we have a prehistoric brain that is part of that explanation, and we can blame that for us being reactive or having a certain type of behavior, but that is not true on a broader level, because from the point that you react, you actually have another choice. So reaction is the first automatic response, and then you choose how you should respond. So responsibility is actually the ability to respond.
Yeah, I think responsibility is a huge word, especially if you come from the victim of circumstances perspective, because then it seems like almost overwhelming. And I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience as well. I have been stuck in a job that was depressive and disengaging, and I guess after 2 months I figured out that is not the right thing for me to do. And it still took me 1.5 years in order to quit that job, because I had beliefs from my parents, from the societal environment that I was brought up to, is I can't allow myself to have a gap in my CV. That is bad for my reputation. I can't just quit a job after 2 months because I don't like it. I mean, how will people look at me? And there were so many assumptions and beliefs that came up that I had to actually face and realize, are they my beliefs? Is this what I'm believing in? Or is it just that somebody else,
you inherited or
inherited it? Yeah. And I'm just living up to that expectation. And I mean, now I realize also, like, I could blame myself for not getting out of this job earlier, but in some way I needed to make these experiences and have this time to process all of this in order to also understand, well, I still have the choice at the end of the day how I react to it. And I chose a different path in my career right now where all these things that I just mentioned are not relevant anymore. And what I'm trying to say here is that of course it's responsibility, and it's also looking at these experiences and seeing what is my role in this, what is my part in this. And sometimes it takes courage also to look at these situations and say, well, maybe I was part of the problem. Maybe I was part of this situation and creating this situation.
You were part of the drama.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wherever I went, the problem went with me. And it didn't change by changing jobs. It only changed after I looked at what are my beliefs and created different experiences then for myself.
So how did you do to create another experience of yourself?
I mean, I would say most physical solution was to find a different environment, to put myself simply in a different environment where I was hoping different beliefs would be appreciated, or different ways of working would be appreciated. And after I realized this is not the case, I realized I have to create these environments myself, because I couldn't find, how can I say it? I couldn't find work environments that related actually to what I was hoping to see in a workplace. And that, I guess, has led me to this point and then to these explorations about what is a life-affirming workplace actually? How does it look like? How can we create such a thing? And what is the benefit for the person working in that? Mental well-being, and so on. And how is this mental well-being, but also, feeling joyful at work, being in creator mode, how is this actually contributing to the organizational growth and profit? This is what I started to do. I just had to create these environments myself.
Yeah, and that is typically another assumption. A lot of the assumptions we have been brought up with, at least in the Western world, is that we should prepare ourselves to have an employment somewhere. That was at least the story I was told, and for me that meant that I studied a lot. So I was into the academia for many years, and the first part of the story was that knowledge was everything. Then I realized that wasn't enough. I also needed experience. But today I would say I've come to a point where I realized that if the knowledge is the dots and the experience is the connection of the dots, then how do I want to connect them? What do I make out of it? That's the journey I've been on relating to the story of the story of how life is created. Either I had to prepare myself to face the future, to find a job, and being in, as you said, a work environment which was probably not either fulfilling me or me fulfilling the workplace. So it was twofold. Or I wanted to create an environment by myself, and that is one way, of course, of doing it. Another one is to build into the system that you can bring as much as yourself into the work situation as possible. That's another assumption you could have, creating an organization, or as you call it, a working environment. You put into the design of the organization that people can bring as much of themselves into the organization as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is what I would recommend everybody to do in the first place now as well. Still, at some point, you have to realize if you do that and it's not appreciated in the environment you are in, then it's probably not the best relationship that you can have with your work, with your colleagues, because you will always
probably with yourself if
Yeah.
you bring
because
it,
you will feel it at some point that this is not sufficient or satisfying for you on many levels.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say right now that a lot of the assumptions that we have made for society and for our organizations and for our own lives are being challenged. Challenged on many levels. And for me, it's a great opportunity actually to see that, okay, so this assumption led us to this point. We can be grateful for that, and we can make a new choice. How do we build our organizations? On what values or on what principles? On what stories? What are the stories we tell ourselves every day when we look in the mirror? What are the stories we tell our children? How do we build a society where learning is a part of day-to-day life, and not something you do in the first part of your life and then you apply it to the rest of your life? How can we not only adapt to change, but also drive change? How can we look at uncertainty and say, wow, it holds possibilities? That's also an assumption. When we looked into to that a couple of days ago in a workshop, we talked about uncertainty, because we have been told that uncertainty is something that is bad. It's something you should reduce, and you should handle it, either by strategic measures or by reducing factors or stuff like that. But what if we could use uncertainty? Because in times of big change lies also the biggest potential. So right now the world is in a tremendously huge potential.
And it's so ironic, I think. I mean, it's first of all, it's a great opportunity, as you say. But when I look at the people and organizations that I have on my awareness, then I'm seeing basically two kind of poles. The one pole is the ones going into fear and then going into
Closing
down basically, and if they are not already completely broken down, because everything that is not sustainable is breaking down right now. And on the other hand, there are people like you and organizations like we can say Emprogage as well, very adaptable, very flexible organizations that are actually thriving in these kind of environments, thriving in these kinds of crisis. I mean, I think crisis. I often hear the word Corona crisis, and I'm thinking like, why don't we call it Corona opportunity? I mean, for many people it's a crisis, but for the other parts of, there's another group of people who really see it as opportunities.
We must then be careful, because right now people are losing their jobs, people are losing their relatives, people are dying, so we have to be cautious about where we put the focus. And I would say that doesn't limit the possibilities. That only reduces it even more. If we look at it as only a crisis, then we have reduced it. I can take, for example, the case I have been into with my family and my daughter, my firstborn daughter, who died when she was 14 months old. And that could, of course, in one direction be only bad. And that is, at some level, only bad. But from that point forward, you can also say, okay, so what good did it bring? How can I amplify that? So if I go for the first solution, everything was for nothing, and I lost everything. But then I also reduce what I had together with my daughter. So if I go in the other direction, if I maximize that direction more or less, I would say how can I create as much meaning as possible from her life? That is actually embracing all that I actually learned and which is pretty much everything I do today. So all the knowledge that I have gained the last 13 years have been related in some way to my firstborn daughter's born, life, and death. That is extremely interesting. And how can I maximize that? How can I bring as much meaning into this as possible?
Yeah, and I mean, I didn't want to bring this up to create some separation, but I think it's just interesting pattern to observe. And then I think we realize with this situation that we are really at the crossroads on so many levels, and at the crossroad you have the choice, and it couldn't be more simply go right or go left. Which way do you want to choose?
That reminds me of this sketch or scene with John Cleese and so on, where they're, I don't remember what movie it was, Fish Go Wonder maybe, where they're driving a car and he says go left, right, and then they went right. So even if you're into right, shall we go left? You're right. So you have to be cautious again, because even if you're in a crossroad, maybe it's not so easy to see which way leads to what. And if you have been going in one direction for a very long time, the response will probably be in a reactive mode into that direction. So you really have to steer yourself and switch focus and be congruent in your new choices. Create not only behaviors, you should create patterns, habits that take you next time you get reactive into a new direction or the new direction that you have chosen. So it's easily said. I mean, it's easy to say it, and it could be easy to do it, but it could also be hard to do it. So you have to be cautious again. What is the direction I'm choosing here?
And I'm reminded of what you always say. So sorry for stealing your words. It's like the new way is hard for a while, and then becomes easy because you get adapted to making choices over and over again, and then it becomes a habit, and at some point habits become a paradigm, and So I think that's an interesting way of
So the crossroad itself, So the crossroad itself is a little, we can use the word problematic, even if it holds possibilities and a potential, because we're not used to it. So if for instance, if you quit smoking, you still have a habit you have to deal with. Even if you quit smoking, you have some kind of, I used to have something in my hand, or whatever you're leaving. And very often when we are at crossroads, we need to leave something of a lower level to be able to make a new choice on a higher level.
Yeah, and I think that is something where trust comes in again, because you don't know what will emerge when you let go of something. But you have to first let go of something in order to make room for something else to emerge. And that can be a scary thing in itself if you're not used to do it. To letting go of things, to not holding on to old habits, old possessions, whatever.
Very often we say that now at least I know what I have. But there are many stories you can have as examples of that not being valid. One thing is the HR person saying to the CEO, what if we give this education or educational program to this employee and they quit? Yes, says the CEO, but what if we don't and they stay?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can find new stories that take us forward. And of course, when we choose a new assumption, a new truth, that will probably, I don't know how to put this, but we are unused to it in the beginning. At the crossroad, it will feel a little bit awkward. And maybe that's something we also can use when we're tired of or we want to leave a certain assumption. That could be a good way to to realize that I'm on a new track, that it feels a little bit awkward. I'm stepping into new stepways, or I stumble a little, or it feels a little bit strange when I put my feet on the ground. It doesn't feel like it used to be, and it doesn't have to be uncomfortable, just awkward.
No, I think we have. I'm just realizing that we might have a strange view of making a choice in some level, because we believe that once we make the choice, it is our new reality. But what you're suggesting is, of course, you have to make a choice at the crossroad, but then with every step in a different direction, you have to reinforce this choice. And this might feel a little bit like wobbly, a little bit like shaky, because you're not used to it. But by every step that you're taking forward, you're reinforcing that choice. And that is important. So it's like a continuous process of habitualizing the choice.
Yeah, and that's interesting at many levels. And maybe choice could be something we could dig into some of the coming programs and have that as the main topic. Because now we are talking about a lot of fundamental assumptions, and there are probably many more of them, and maybe we should dig into the choice itself and its connection to whatever it is behind the choice, consciousness or whatever. So maybe we should take that into a program of itself.
Yeah,
What
I
do you
think
about
that's
that?
that's a great way. And do you have anything else that you would like to say for fundamental assumptions?
Yeah, I can bring on some stuff here. When you start realizing that you've actually a lot of fundamental assumptions, you can sit down and write down things I hold as true on one side of the list, and then you can think of, can I do a new assumption on the same topic? For instance, learning. One way of looking at learning is that it's something that I have to learn from someone else in a book, or I have to read something, or I have to go to a course. Or another assumption is that learning is something that I can put into any experience, and that will mean that we could actually learn from each other, and we could also learn together. And what would that do? That assumption, if I change that assumption from again outside in, something that I have to get from someone, a knowledge or whatever it is, to something we create together. What would happen if I do that and put myself into that learning situation? How would such a learning situation look like? And then you can go to the next. Okay, so this topic is about parenting, say, or this is about leadership, or this topic is about, and this is the assumption I have. Can I make another assumption? And what would that assumption look like? And what would happen if I put myself into that assumption? If I really embrace that, how would that situation then, or that context that I'm in, really look like?
And I think what you're describing here is not only the process, but actually a very applicable tool of how to do it, actually, is by, for example, writing it down. What are my assumptions for a specific topic? Can I, visualize them? And then by doing that, I'm already stepping, in front of it or behind it.
We can take some examples here. For instance, we have seen a lot of organizations that have said to their employees, you can work from home. I know workplaces that I've been into that the fundamental assumption was that work is something you do at the workplace. End. That was like period. And as long as we hold that maxim for truth, we will probably not be able to work from any other place. I couldn't work from the coffee shop, or I couldn't work from my from my holiday, or from wherever I was. I had to be at work at a certain time and leaving at another certain time, and I couldn't do anything else that it was called work outside those working hours, and on the other side I couldn't do any private stuff either in that working hours. Isn't that really odd when you talk about it and think about it? And then if you apply that into this list, it would say work can only be done on the workplace between, say, 9 and 5. Can I make another assumption? Work can be done on any place at any time. Do I want to do it on any time? No, I don't want to do it in the nights. I don't want to do it when my kids are home, but I can do it from other places. And at some time periods, maybe in a very intense work period, I could dedicate another couple of hours that day. But on the other hand, it also makes me able to, okay, so this lunch is a 3-hour lunch out in the sun when the sun is shining, or whatever it is. So it moving from one assumption to another makes new possibilities, but also new limitations, of course. So I have to choose which limitations and possibilities I want to have from each choice on that fundamental level.
Yeah, and you're back again to, first of all, choosing, but second of all, envisioning and dreaming up, like, what would my ideal work day look like? What are the circumstances I can work? What are, maybe non-negotiable times where I would like to spend time with my family, with my kids, and say, well, I'm not reachable. And, nobody really says, I think nowadays, when we are really having the opportunity to be knowledge workers, and we don't have to be at the production plant at a certain amount of hours in a specific time, it opens up a lot of opportunities. And at the same time, we have to find a way of, if we, for example, work together as colleagues, what is an appropriate time for you to be reached? What is an appropriate time for me to be reached? And we have to find an agreement that we can both.
And that could be different agreements with different persons, different situations even. Right now we're here in this dialogue. It's after normal working hours. That's a choice we made. And it enables us to do it. And that's interesting itself. And which means that tomorrow morning I will probably have a longer sleep. And it enables also, not only us doing this, but also having a context where there is nothing knocking on the door at the end of this dialogue saying you have to be finished, you have to finish it now, it has to be done before blah blah blah, and so on. So we have a realm of possibilities that we have chosen together. That okay, so if we do those podcasts, we need approximately 40 to 1 hour of podcasting time. But what if we're into something and it takes 1.5 hours? That's perfectly okay. And what if we don't have anything to say to each other for 30 minutes? Then it's okay too.
Then we have a very silent podcast.
Yeah. Maybe we should have one episode called Silence.
I think that would be an interesting choice to make.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jens, for those interesting ideas on fundamental assumptions.
Yeah, I feel like we put out a lot of assumptions that we have encountered in our experiences in our life. And I can only say to all the listeners and viewers, this is an invitation to sit down, especially now in these times of Corona opportunities, to reflect a little bit on what are my fundamental assumptions. How would I like to be them? How would I like to choose ideally? And I can only speak from my personal experience, and I can only say that this journey has been really eye-opening on some level, but also very inspiring, very interesting, and then listen to, and observing with a very curious mind of what is emerging there and what is actually beliefs and assumptions that I would like to choose for myself. And yeah, I can only say it has come to a very interesting and point.
Yeah. And at some point in life, you get this, again, events, whatever it is, that trigger you maybe to think of new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, new ways of working, whatever it is. And right now we're experiencing such an event worldwide together. So it gives, again, the opportunity, Corona opportunity. I like that. Again, with a humble thought to those who are facing really difficulties, and at the same time also embracing the opportunities that we can seize in those Corona opportunities. Yeah.
And I think that's something I really look forward to, because I feel like in these times a lot of systems are breaking down, or at least the systemic issues are brought up to the surface, and it gives us the chance to deal with it, because I see a lot of suffering on a personal level resulting out of systems that we have designed in the past based on different assumptions that which purpose is no longer serving us. And this is something I'm looking forward to, and I think that touches a little bit also on one of the dimensions, proactivity again. How can we now use these insights, these learnings, to create resilience for the future? And I think we will also have an episode on these dimensions in particular, where we look into like what is actually proactivity, how can we use it to our advantage. I think that's something I'm personally looking forward to.
So thank you very much. If you listen to this podcast or watch the stream on YouTube, please subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support us, please go to patreon.com bestfortheworld and help us forward for making those pods and webcasts. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll say thanks for now, and welcome back to FiDE.
See you next time.
See you next time. Bye.
We are creating the world we're now living in. We are competing in. We are repeating in. We are believing in. It's time for us to shift our mind from best in the world to best for the world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. It creates a new world to mind a shift, intentionality, perceptuality, conceptuality. We are choosing to shift our mind to best for the world, best for our world. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional. Make decisions intentional, to take decisions intentional, making decisions intentional.